Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome our third and final guest from the film The Creator, production designer James Clyne. James will talk us through the world-building aspect of the film and the decisions that he had to make in creating the film. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with James. Hi, James. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Happy to sit down and talk about The Creator, which at the time of recording will be, when I release this, will be out on home video and DVD and Blu-ray, so everybody can see all the behind the scenes and see your work there, and obviously see the film. It's crazy to
Yeah.
think that I don't know, sometimes the timing of releases always gives you a really good sense of how quick time actually goes, because it's just it probably for you probably feels like you only worked on the film not so long ago, but for audience members seeing it in the cinema, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, time really gets warped working on a film. I spent off and on, I spent at least 3 years on The Creator through the pandemic and out the other end of the pandemic, and I worked in post-production as well on it. So yeah, the timing, and then the movie was done, and we waited until end of September for it to release. So it's been a wild ride, and yeah, time seems to be completely warped by the whole experience.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of the days bleed into one when you're working away on the project. And how did the project come about in the first place? And am I right in thinking this was your first job as a production designer?
It was. I worked on an animated feature as a production designer years ago. It never happened. But yeah, this is technically my first production design gig, which was huge and kind of scary. But I've been in the film industry long enough to kind of know generally what the job means and entails, and so that part was kind of not so scary. But I I got a call. I worked with a producer, Kiri Hart, who I worked with on a couple of the Star Wars productions. She was putting this together with Gareth Edwards, and she's like, "Hey, do you want to go meet Gareth? I'm not going to really tell you much more than that, but if you want to go down to LA and have some lunch, let me know." And I said, "Yeah, sign me up." And we had lunch down in Santa Monica, and we just talked all things sci-fi and completely geeked out for about 3 hours. Talked about his movie a little bit, but more about kind of our influences. We're about the same age. I'm a little older than Gareth, but we grew up digesting all the same film and television everywhere from obviously like Star Wars, but like Escape from New York or Buck Rogers on television. Like we just kind of we ate up the same kind of stuff. So because of that, we kind of already started down a road that's made sense. Like we just like the same things. So with that, it just made it a lot easier to get into it.
I think as well, once you get an idea of having the same sort of childhood in terms of taste. I know you've worked with Gareth before, but I think when you're talking about ideas and projects and saying remember when we were younger and then we watched this, and you kind of blew your mind that they made something like this on TV or on film. I think I had that with Jerry Anderson's Space Precinct, which was like a big
Mm-hmm.
show in the UK. I think at one point it was the most expensive TV show ever made, because I think it cost them £1 million per episode or something like that. And this was
Oh my
the
God.
90s, so it's probably something normal now, but at that time it was huge. Um,
Wow.
which is crazy. I hope I'm right about that, because if I'm wrong, then apologies. But once you start talking to one another and discussing ideas of stuff that you like, I guess it kind of helps with understanding what project's going to happen, what the project will be, and the sort of ideas that want to be presented in the film. Not just, I guess, not in story wise, but look wise as well. I guess if you already have that inspiration for the film, do you start with like watching films that you guys have talked about and start making notes of what kind of looks cool and what doesn't look cool, and then start taking inspiration and going from there?
Yeah, I think I think that's a good way of playing it. We we look at a lot of inspirations, movies being one of them, artists being another. One movie specifically was this movie called Baraka that came out in the 90s. It's actually a non-narrative film, beautifully shot. I think the director's Ron Frick. Just beautiful photography all over the world. He took a big 70 millimeter camera and shot just beautiful photography of everything from Tibet to Japan to Thailand, and it just kind of inspired us to want to make a movie that was as visually stunning and kind of grounded in a culture, but then expand the design and the technology beyond today's aesthetic. So we both love Baraka. I probably watched Baraka again after our initial conversation. And then it was a matter of just gathering up reference of what it means to set a movie in Southeast Asia and blend both the existing culture with futuristic cultures. And then we'd have to dig into, well, what is a futuristic culture? What does it mean to be in the future? And one thing we set out to do is not try to predict the future necessarily. Rather, we kind of embraced some of the past. And a good example of that was we looked at Japanese electronics from the 90s or even the 80s, like the Walkman or the Discman, and looked at like, why did those products look so much more interesting than products today? I mean, products today are very simple and slick and just a pane of glass, which makes sense for what it is, but cinematically, it's not really interesting to have like somebody holding an iPad. It's just not all that tactile and interesting to look at. So we looked at old products from again from that time and then thought, well, what if we took those products and mashed two of them together or mashed three of them together and made a whole new product out of it? And so kind of talking on that level, we actually took products like existing products and combined them to make something new. And so you'd see something like a strange new blender or something sitting in the background. And then that would become, oh, I'm looking at an old farmer's house in somewhere in Thailand, but the farmer has like these products that are just sitting around that don't look like products we have today. They don't quite look like futuristic products. They just look something totally different. And we kind of kit bash. There's a term we use from Star Wars called kit bashing. I'm sure you're familiar with, but we actually took real products that we bought online and repurposed them and changed them in a way that gave us a different look.
I think it's quite cool to like get an understanding of what the look and feel would be, and thinking like what would a futuristic Southeast Asia look like. I think as well, I guess as like a production design point stand of view, you also think like what would come first in this sort of world that they'll have a, as you said, a certain blender, but like how would this piece of item come to be in this sort of time? Would you have a place that's a tribe that might be slightly futuristic, and then you go into a city that's even more futuristic and will have, what's it called, like the big LED panels on the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess as well, like as a design point, it's like that must be quite fun as well, being able to be based in the future. You kind of have a lot more creative freedom, more, or maybe you have less creative freedom because you don't know how to play it in terms of how you want to show things.
Yeah, I think one approach that we took on this film was let's not design the world first. Let's actually shoot the existing world, whether it be Bangkok or Phuket or even Tokyo. Let's shoot those first, and then with those plates, let's create the world around it. So we did a certain amount of pre-production where we had to design some sets and props and costume and all that stuff to make sure that there's stuff in camera. But for a lot of the stuff, like a big futuristic city, we waited until Gareth shot those those locations, and then we designed buildings in it. And one design aesthetic I wanted to play with building design was that it went horizontal, almost like a bridge. That instead of just going completely vertical, why not go up and then across and then back down? And that way you save space on the ground and you can build even more, higher up. But it's parallel. It's not vertical. So stuff like that. We kind of played with the look and aesthetic and an idea of just general urban design, but then push it into kind of a sci-fi look. And one of the other big things that Gareth and I loved, or films that Gareth and I loved, was the original Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott Blade Runner. It just had such an impact on us in terms of its look and feel. It wasn't trying to, again, be a predictor of the future. It kind of held on to the past, but also created its own weird evolutionary branch of the future. And I personally could still look at that movie and be in wonderment, even though like it took place in 2019 or something. It doesn't really matter. It still stays fresh and new because creatively they just took it in such a different direction. I think that's something we tried to do as much as we could in our movie, of feeling like it's kind of timeless, but also some kind of look of the future. And that look of the future was, distinct and new and fresh.
I think Blade Runner is always a big. I think it's always a big inspiration for anything sci-fi. Just because, as you mentioned, like you can watch that film, and granted, I know it's supposed to be set in 2019, and we are in 2023, and it's nothing like that, unfortunately. But when you look at that film, it has that sort of flawless look to it in terms of that film standing the test of time of how it's going to look and how it's going to feel. I think with the creator, I think when you're setting it away from somewhere, instead of having it in North America but having it in Southeast Asia, you can play around with the looks and feels a lot more. And it's the same with cinematography and the looks of the beautiful nature surrounding it. Because I think if you look at LA, granted in the film, there has been a nuclear bomb that's has got off and has destroyed the city, but you can tell that there's like a big difference between how one side of the world lives compared to the other, and whose like reliance on things kind of maybe hinder that way of living as well.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely did want to show some contrast between LA, America, and Southeast Asia. The hope, what comes across is that, the cultures in Southeast Asia, there's a bit of a harmonious kind of connection between the new tech and the old tech. And in LA, it's almost like a contrast. Like they put up a big wall around what we called ground zero in LA, and it just kind of slams down onto the city without any apparent thought behind where it's going to sit in relationship to the city. They just kind of slammed it down. And in our new Asia environments, hopefully it feels very integrated and seamless, and you don't really question it. You just kind of go with it.
Yes, and also you're looking at it in a way that it's like you kind of want to live here more, and it has that better feeling of like, wow, this place is actually pretty cool. Especially with this is the sort of place you'd like to visit, compared to North America. but with, I guess, integrating of the cities and reliance of AI and robots and whatnot, this
Mm-hmm.
film is like, it's not just about like the buildings and ships in this film, it's also about the robots. And we do see some distinct looks, and different types of robots. So for example, in the LA bomb site, we have a robot that looks like the traditional sense, where it's just a body shell and wires. Then you have a police robot that reminds me a little bit of Alpha 5 from Power Rangers. So you have that sort of, I love that design because it's kind of like reminds me of my childhood. So you kind of have that little bit of a throwback feeling. And then you have the resistance fighters who have the holes in their heads. In terms of like a design point of view, where do you begin with that process, and then how do you go about creating each robot to be as distinctive as possible, or should I say each like group of robots to be as distinctly as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big challenge. There was a lot to kind of digest when you read how many robots are kind of in the script. And I think what helped was Gareth had a pretty good idea of, hey, the insurgents are gonna be mostly human looking, but maybe there's tech on the back or there's a hole through the head. Maybe the police robots are just more traditional robotic looking. And then there's another even class of robots that just are various shapes and sizes and colors. And the first thing you do is you just kind of sit down, you just start looking at reference, you start sketching, you start talking about how they look different, why they should look different, and then you feed all that information to your other artists. I had a great team of artists working on it, like Lynn Dillon, Brian Sum, and let them kind of just run with it as well and see what shapes you come up with. We weren't too specific of like, hey, we need something to look like a praying mantis, or we need something to look like this or that, but maybe they're kind of insectoid. Maybe some of them look a little bit more human because their head is a bit proportionally like a human head. Maybe there's some that are completely stretched and don't look like a human head at all. And it starts just kind of big, broad strokes, and then expands beyond that. And then we kind of had like maybe like 80 different designs, and then we kind of would start to almost like casting. We'd go, okay, let's take this group and let's grab 10 out of that group, let's grab that group, grab 10 out of there, and we kind of have to kind of cull it down to a best of 7 or 8. And then there were specific things like the police robot we knew we needed, and we knew they wanted to be distinct, so we kind of targeted that a little bit using a bit of the color and look of the actual costume, because those were initially Gareth shot real humans with prop guns and helmets and gear, kind of SWAT gear on them that was designed. And it wasn't until post that we removed the heads and then kind of did something totally different. So I wanted to kind of keep the color palette that was already there, keep the vibe that was already there, but make it in such a way that, ooh, that is definitely not a human with a mask on. That's definitely something else. So that was another layer to it as well, of like, we wanted to make sure our robots didn't feel like you could just put a mask on them and then digitally remove maybe the back of it or the side of it or something. We wanted to make it look like it was almost impossible to have anything other than what you see on screen. But yeah, big process. It requires a lot of conversations with the director, a lot of conversations with your art department of trying to figure out where to go with it.
Yeah, I guess when you're working on some of this as well, you probably have a big team as well to help you out. And coming up with that, it's like 80 different designs for the robots is probably that's quite a lot. And it's there must have been so many ways where it's like, well, we could just change this one a little bit, we could change this one, this one's going to be completely different, this one's going to be completely different as well. There's so much, probably there's probably never a wrong answer on the design point until it came down to the dwindling down part, where you have to decide what's going to look best for the film, and how the design in terms of like the continuity between everybody would work.
Yeah, very much so. And it's all a process. You're under the gun with a schedule and a budget and all that stuff. So it's it's intense, but it's also fun to kind of really kind of figure out how to take all these ideas and whittle it down to what would eventually be up on screen.
And I think as well, like if you are time restraint and budget restraint, then it's what's going to look the best, but also not cost us the most. I guess those conversations are very difficult to have as well, because you don't want to use all that money just for one design, rather than spread it out on potentially five.
Yeah, that's right. And on top of it all, we're working with a great company like ILM, who is helping us figure out, okay, well, if you want it in this many shots, this is how much it's gonna cost, and so there's a lot of conversations back and forth of like, how can we do this for what we have? It's just a constant conversation of trying to figure that out. But you're working with really talented people and smart people that fortunately it doesn't all completely blow up in your face.
Yes, and I was lucky enough to speak to Charmaine from ILM regarding the creator
Oh,
as well, and
she's
there
great.
was certain thing. She was very complimentary of you as well, and saying it was amazing that you had a background in ILM, because that sort of bridge of production design and VFX conversations were a lot easier, because you understood how things would work, and how they would work as well. And I guess as sometimes the way you could see it is probably like the production design sometimes is the theory of an idea, but then the visual effects is like the practical side of the idea of like what can be done or what cannot be done, or how much it would cost if it can be done. But with a film like this as well, because it is very visual effects heavy, and you do, it's amazing to think that like when you're watching it, like how much is visual effects and the incredible work that people have done with it. It's the same with the robots, with the side of their heads. I was told that when people were looking through, they didn't actually have a plate shot for that. That was all done by artists,
Mm,
composite, which is just like blows my mind, because I would have thought that you would have a plate shot or something to insert. But anyway, but how does
yeah.
something but how does like VFX play in your designing? And is it a case that you could be a bit more creative knowing that you have that visual effects element behind you?
Yeah, I mean, the creator was very unique in that we kind of flipped things on its head a little bit in terms of how you typically go about making a movie. One of those things being we held off on designing a lot of the work in the beginning to the end. So we we still had stuff to design. We had a lot of things that were on camera, but Gareth knew that he wanted to make his movie, shoot his movie, and then augment the movie as much as we could afterwards. So we weren't creating environments completely out of nothing, out of whole cloth. We were kind of using what we had already shot in locations, a little bit on set. We had some sets that we did, but there was a whole nother design process, and I hired a whole nother art department in post production, which is quite odd for a production designer to stay through to the end, but it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Maybe it was another conversation I was having earlier. Sorry. But in Star Wars, I would be, I was, I'd come in early, work with the director to develop the idea, and then oftentimes be at Pinewood, working at Pinewood, and then come back and work in VFX and art direct the VFX in the end. So I was very comfortable kind of seeing it all the way through. And I think Gareth saw that importance in me to be able to kind of see it all the way through. So we knew we would save a little bit money in the beginning, hold that money till the end, and then develop the VFX in the end. Now, once a movie's shot, you're kind of jumping into VFX right away. You're getting plates back and you're working on those plates and comping in all kinds of stuff. There had to be a little bit of overlap of my team designing a whole nother kind of set of stuff to hand over and feed ILM's pipeline. But we got through it in the end. And I think it was very creative to be able to go, okay, let's change this building. Let's change this guy into a robot. Let's change this vehicle into a more futuristic vehicle. And we had a director with Gareth who was very comfortable doing it at that point, making those decisions kind of a little bit later in the game. Fortunately, ILM was very flexible and allowed us to kind of squeeze a lot of that stuff in, which in other films, again, would already be complete and handed off. But that's not how we want to make our movie. We want to do it differently. And I think it was a very successful way of doing it. You just have to kind of all hold hands and kind of jump in together and agree that this is how we're going to do it.
You know, when you're sort of talking to other departments about going about this way, is it difficult to sort of get them to understand what the overall plan will be later on, so that you could, I don't know, just get them on board really? Because I can imagine sometimes, as you said, like the traditional way is more that it's shot and then worked on, rather than hiring a whole different team to sort of design around it. I'm guessing, obviously, you're hiring a whole other team because they know and have experience of doing it this sort of way, or have an understanding of it. But then, if there's, say, for example, set decorating, are there times where they'll have to decorate certain sets, like on the stages? But if it's stuff like on location, are there ideas still sort of put into it, or is it a case of you guys take the baton and lead the whole way?
I mean, what we designed and built for sets and locations, those all kind of stayed within the shot. And then it was a matter of Gareth and I kind of almost going shot by shot, or he would give me a selection of shots and go, hey, let's put something here, let's add something there. It was all built upon a conversation that he and I would have, basically scene to scene, shot to shot. And we tried to squeeze as much as we could into each shot that we could. And we wanted to just fill each image with as much kind of, visual goodness as we could, provided with the time and budget we had. But I had a lot of freedom. I think at that point, Gareth, I think, trusted me in kind of making a lot of those calls. But at the same time, we had technology like Zoom, and we can kind of just jump on a Zoom call and have a quick conversation about something. And hopefully he felt confident after a call to go, okay, let's go in that direction. But it was, yeah, it's all a collaboration, and Gareth was just a great collaborator to kind of jump into those waters that just hadn't really been treaded before. Nobody had really kind of done it this way on the scale before. But because of his background in VFX and my background in VFX, I think we were confident, and maybe a little bit, I don't know, on my part, a little bit naive about, like, yeah, we could totally do all this and make it all happen. And fortunately, again, because we were on the same page, I think it made that process possible.
In a way, if you have that sort of naivety, sometimes it's that, I guess, you go into it with like that gleam of like, yeah, we could do this, we could sort it out, and you become a little bit more hypersensitive on decisions and decision making because you're doing it in such a different way. And I guess this probably leads to another question about budget as well, because there's been a lot of publicity about how low the budget is for a sci-fi film and the way that it looks. And I feel like you've probably explained a little bit about it, in terms of just going about it a way that you may think it's a bit like naivety, but at the same time, holding on to money and releasing it at the correct time, and then also going about it in a different way. But as somebody's coming on as a designer, like with budgetary restraints, how does that affect you as a designer? Going about it in a certain way. But I guess if you have that challenge, does it make it more fun to do your work that way?
It's always nice to have just a huge budget, but that huge budget also comes with complications of its own. Sometimes it is even more complicated because you have so much more that you've got to juggle. I think having a smaller budget, it was just another problem to solve, and I was up for the challenge. I don't think movies need to be made for $300 million, to be honest. I think they could be made a lot cheaper, and I think the creator has kind of proven that. It just requires us to all kind of think, okay, how do we make it cheaper? And how do we go about making it cheaper? And we just kind of have to go knowing that we're not going to have unlimited funds. One way we cut down on it was we didn't build huge sets where we held on to a soundstage for 5 or 6 weeks. We leaned on locations and then augmented locations. We did have some sets that were quite complicated, and we used stagecraft to help kind of make those sets look even bigger. But one way we saved money was we just didn't build huge sets. That's not to say that other movies are going to require that. You're going to need a huge backlot or a huge sound stage, but we knew our movie didn't require that kind of look. So we would shoot in like a rice factory outside of Bangkok. And we liked the kind of look of it because it was industrial and it had really high ceilings and it already had kind of a lighting quality to it. It was kind of cool. And we would bring in small set pieces to kind of top it off, and let the actors interact with. But we also were confident, hey, we can turn this into anything we want later on. Let's just not worry about it now. Let's shoot it for what it is. And we'll put in a big door, circular door that opens up that our hero Joshua walks through. We'll, add more sci-fi piping or lighting to it later, knowing that kind of the bones of that location is just great and cool. We were confident that we can make it look even better later on rather than building a $700,000 set that is just going to be struck, 5 weeks later. That was the process we used on this. I think that was one way of saving money. There were many other ways, but that's kind of a good example of how we saved a bit of money.
I think as well, like the use of locations and set compared to set builds. I guess with like a set, you can have more control over it compared to a location. But in terms of like vision and how a director wants to go about it, I guess location will always just edge it slightly with how you want to have the look and feel and the authenticity of it all.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Another part of it is just having a director who has the foresight to know that, we can change this into anything we want later on, but wants a real place with real lighting and actors in a real space, interacting with a real space, then and there at that time, which was just as important to him as augmenting it later.
I can imagine that as well. There is a question that's popped into my mind as well, in terms of when you're talking about the VFX, the designing and inserting stuff after the shooting and hiring another team. When it comes to the design aspect of that, and then there's the post team that come in, so you get your sound design team and coming in. With the post team coming in, did your designs change after the fact once you start hearing certain things like sound design of the tank going by?
Sound design obviously is by a whole nother team. They come in quite late into production when there's at least a first cut of the film. So even though we might be doing designs right around when they're developing their own library of work, I didn't hear a single thing until I saw the movie and its completion. But and I love that sometimes. It's like, oh wow, they made that thing sound like that. That's so cool. I didn't even imagine it sounding like that, but it was such a wonderful surprise to hear all of that put in. So what we're looking at in post is just a there's no sound to the sequences and shots that we're looking at. And if there is, it's audio that was recorded on the day. So it would be fun to kind of work with those guys and figure out the design and the sound at the same time. That would be such a wonderful experience. But unfortunately, it's all kind of, in bits and pieces as it's moving forward. And but then you get it again, you get to walk into the theater and be pleasantly surprised by all the sound additions, all the DI work, and of course the soundtrack and score, all that stuff. Um, that comes later.
You ever have moments where you look at your design and then you hear something and you think, oh man, like we already knew it looked badass, but now it just sounds even more badass.
Yeah, I mean the sound is so important to it. I mean, obviously it's just as important of a medium to to the picture itself, and all it does is just elevate everything that you've done beforehand. Yeah, for sure.
I can imagine. Just to sort of get to another design question, I'd love to talk about the design of the Nomad. It feels like a big bird of prey in space, flying over and scoping out for potential AI targets. And it's weird to think that like this big ship is up there, but it just has that constant menace, and then also the blue light that it sort of like whilst it's scanning as well. It's just like when you see it, you think this is actually quite scary, and you don't know where it's going to lead to, and what the destruction it might cause.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's just how does it relate to the story? What's in the script? Which there's a lot of description of it and how it targets and how it kind of basically feeds on its prey, but also acts as a marker for a target. So all those ideas are coming from Gareth's head. It's just like, well, what is the shape of this thing? And during the pandemic, Gareth and I had the one positive thing is we got to spend a lot of time together while the movie was kind of put on pause. And one of the things we really tried to figure out was the Nomad. So we'd be on 5 hour Zooms, and I'd just be sketching away or pulling in reference and coming up with new shapes. We probably did, I don't know, I would guess close to 1,000 different sketches and looks for it until we finally arrived on this kind of bird of prey. I was thinking about this movie, Pink Floyd, The Wall. I don't know if you ever saw it, obviously based on the album. It's a trippy movie, but there's these animated sequences through it. And one of the sequences is kind of this bird of prey, this kind of black raven thing that's um, very fascist in nature and very kind of dangerous looking. Like I just texted Gareth that image. I was like, what if it had a little bit of this kind of feel to it? Gareth and I share, amongst many things, Pink Floyd, our admiration for Pink Floyd. So he was into that kind of like bird of prey idea, and then the design just evolved from there. Gareth is he's another designer in the room for sure. Some directors leave it up to the designer or the art department to do all the visuals. Gareth is, in my mind, just as good as any other designer. He might not sketch the way other artists do, but the way his brain works, he thinks very three dimensionally in a 3D space. So he wants to know that it looks cool from the bottom, it looks cool from the top, it looks cool from the side. And we had to kind of keep our brains wrapped around all of that. And then we brought in an artist, Alex Senecal, who's kind of known more for video game design, but does use like amazing industrial design looking weapons. And so he helped us kind of flesh out after we kind of had a general blocked in look for it. He really helped flesh out, all the kind of surface design in 3D. And then we had a nice little asset at the end of it that we shared with ILM, and ILM went in and texture mapped it, and I kind of art directed to completion, basically. But yeah, it was a big process, but ultimately the kind of initial germ of the idea came from this Pink Floyd film that I saw as a kid, and it kind of freaked me out. Might have just stayed in the back of my head all these years. But yeah, that's how we came about that one.
Isn't it funny though how you can take stuff from your childhood that scared you and sort of implement it in work today and have that sort of like, this traumatized me as a kid, so let's go traumatize all these other people with it, and use that sort of horror and ideas into my work.
Yeah, we're a bit of a sadistic that way maybe. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this comes from, for me personally, from my subconscious, from either a dream or a thought or a memory. A lot of it just comes from that. It doesn't come from being too analytical about it. It comes from like just a thought or an idea or a nightmare that I had. I think those are the best because maybe those are more universal. Maybe we all have a bit of the same fear, and subconsciously some shape or color or visual kind of scares us all. I mean, think of like the fin of a great white shark. Like, there's not a single person that on this planet that isn't terrified of that simple triangle penetrating the water coming at you. Like, it's just, for whatever reason, it's evolved in that way, and we've evolved in a way to be scared of that shape.
Yeah, and isn't it crazy as well when you have that, like as you said, it's just that shape. It's that a triangle, and as you said, we've evolved to be scared of that, and then this big bird of prey object in the sky is something that's created from your fear from the Pink Floyd film. But then also, I don't know if you've ever seen, so like near Pinewood, like 3 miles away, there's an area where they have like red kites flying around, and my brother-in-law saw one with this complete wingspan open, and he thought it was like a 6 foot man in his garden, and that's how terrified he was. So whenever I saw that image of the nomad, it just made me think of that, and it made me think of like this big. You don't realize how big it is until you see the big scope of it.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe that plays into some subconscious fear that we all have of a certain shape, or, I think it goes back tens of thousands of years into our evolution. We're just engineered to be scared of a certain thing, just, I think it's Darwinian. It's meant to keep us alive. Something shaped like a saber-toothed tiger, then we fucking run the other way because that's the shape that we're terrified of. So yeah. So I think all of that played into the nomad. And there's two fangs coming down from the nomad that emit that kind of blue laser. And we like the idea of it having kind of like fangs pointed towards Earth. It's kind of an aggressive way to kind of look at it too.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I think that will always sort of haunt me as that sort of bird and that story my brother-in-law told me.
Cool. Glad I could help scare you and your brother-in-law.
Great. Can't wait for nightmares tonight. Um, um, just to hit with my penultimate question. When you're shooting a film like this on location and then on some sound stages in Pinewood, do you ever have to think about the continuity in the scenes if a scene is spread over between a location and a soundstage?
Yeah, for sure. In this case, the stuff we shot at Pinewood was just specific to nomad interiors. So we had a certain amount of freedom to go, okay, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be whatever we want it to be. We did shoot some locations in Thailand of like a convention hall. It had a bit of a futuristic look to it, a very clean, kind of modern look. But we changed some of that and augmented some of that too. But we had a lot of freedom for the stuff that we did at Pinewood because it was all just specific to Nomad, and we hadn't really shot anything prior to that, with the exception of a few locations. But typically in a film, yeah, you want to tie in seamlessly as much as you can from stage to location.
Yeah, because I can imagine sometimes as well, like in the excitement of it all and having a location and then a stage, which way are they going to enter the ship, for example? Oh, on location they entered it this way. It's like, oh, okay, we might have built it the wrong way around, or we might have to flip it around a little bit or work it out.
Yeah, all that stage direction, all that stuff is certainly thought out beforehand, whether it's a storyboard or it's just a conversation with the director and a bunch of people of like, okay, where does he come onto the ship? How does he board? How does he transition from this piece to that piece? Yeah, it gets quite complicated, becomes a bit of a puzzle, but but yeah, you figure it out.
Yeah, I can imagine it could be a lot of fun as well to see, to like sort of map out how things are going to move, from drawing it on paper to making models of the sets. Just to hit with my final question, what was your favorite set to design?
Yeah, it's a good segue to the airlock on the Nomad. So there's this whole moment where Alfie is trying to start up this whole systems of initiating this escape pod. At the same time, Joshua is running out of air, so she's got to run over and make sure a door closes that he can kind of access more oxygen. We built this big, like 60-foot long gantry that connects to this escape pod with an escape pod door. And on the opposite side, there was a whole airlock space. And then all of that we designed to wheel in to a stagecraft volume set. So we had a whole volume kind of 360 around it. And it was a really complicated set to figure out because there's a lot of interaction with the actors and what they needed to do in that scene. And then the design of like trying to figure out how do we get actor from point A to point B. All of that stuff was really complicated, but it was a lot of fun to try to figure out because we started very simple and like, what is this? How does this work? Really rough sketches and trying to lay it all out. And then it just kind of evolved and evolved and evolved to the point where you get to stand on that set and go, wow, look at this. There's this bleeds into this, it connects to that thing. And then on top of it, you have this huge world that you've had to create in CG to surround and light the set. So it was a lot of moving parts. It was probably the most complicated piece of the whole film, but I think in the end it all came together nicely and hopefully feels seamless in the end. But it started out as many parts that had to kind of come together and turn into one, functioning thing.
When it comes to a set like that, what's the best way to attack it, knowing that there's going to be a lot of moving parts? Do you do it in stages where you think, okay, it's going to be like this, and then start again, knowing that there might be something that needs to be more, that's going to move a lot more?
I mean, it starts with breaking down the script, understanding, where an actor is going to be in relationship to another actor. Sometimes it's not figured out really in the script, so you kind of have to take what you find in the script and then you just have conversations with the director and producers and sometimes the DP. We built a kind of a very rough model of the whole set and then put it in VR. And we all jumped on the goggles. Gareth was in LA. Greg and Oren, our DPs, were, I think Greg was in the UK. Oren was in LA. I was in San Francisco. And we all put these goggles on and kind of called a VR scout. We kind of went into the set, and Gareth is very comfortable with kind of flying around a set in VR, setting up cameras. And that was a great way for us all to be in a space and kind of look at the space virtually and know, okay, so we can scale it up this size, we can scale it down, we can stretch things, we can add pieces based on what he needed for the story. And then there's a further understanding of like what we build and what we leave for VFX or what we leave for the volume itself. So that was a fun process. I'm not as accustomed to it as some of the other people. I got a little spun around a couple times, but it was a great way for us to all be there and kind of figure out a lot of the unanswered questions months and months before we'd have to actually build something.
It's so like fascinating as well to hear probably how much has changed as well from a design point of view and using the VR headsets to walk through sets and understanding what lenses you might be using here or how something's going to be moving before you even physically get there. I'm probably going to be the same as you. If I put a VR headset on, I'll probably get spun around and feel a bit woozy from it all, just because it's just a bit weird. With like the whole idea of it all. Also wear glasses just like you, so it probably would have felt a bit odd putting that over your head as well.
Yeah, I mean the designs are they accommodate people wearing glasses. That wasn't a problem. It was like being in there for like 3 hours. Like the first 2 hours I think I was fine, and then it's like hour three. It's like, oh God, we got to take a break, guys. Yeah, you don't want to see me lose my lunch or something. But it was, I think it's a great tool, and we eventually I personally kind of got the hang of it after a few hours being in there. But I think it's just a tool, and there's plenty of other ways to kind of scout a set. You know, you can build a white model, a scale model of it. You can do blueprints of it, see it from a plans and elevation point of view. But for that specific set, because it was so complicated, it was great for us to all be in VR and kind of look at it from that point of view.
Yeah, and you can all do it from the comfort of your own home, and not worry about meeting up. James, thank you so much for your time today. The Creator is out now on Blu-ray, DVD, 4K, and on VOD. Go watch it and see all of James's beautiful design, or James and his team's beautiful designs. Thank you again, James.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me. It was a fun conversation to have, and yeah, I look forward to it being posted.
Cool, I appreciate it. You take care. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
All right, man. See ya.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.